October 2nd, 1941. 30 hours. Colonel General Heinz Guderian stood in the command tent of Panzer Group 2, staring at a weather report that would help seal the fate of Operation Barbarossa. Outside, the first drops of autumn rain pattered against canvas. Inside, his staff officers debated routes, fuel supplies, and enemy positions. Nobody discussed what those raindrops meant. The meteorological data sat ignored on a corner desk, stamped with classifications nobody bothered to read. German High Command had been warned. Soviet specialists captured in the first weeks of invasion had tried to explain. Even their own Eastern Front veterans from the First World War had cautioned them. But the warnings about Rasputitsa, the season of mud, were dismissed as Russian propaganda, peasant superstition, or cowardice disguised as caution. The German army, fresh from crushing France in 6 weeks and Yugoslavia in 11 days, believed itself immune to weather. They had conquered nations. They had rewritten military doctrine. They had perfected blitzkrieg warfare. What threat could rain possibly pose to the most modern, mechanized military force ever assembled? Within 3 weeks, that question would be answered in the most brutal way imaginable. The mighty Wehrmacht, having driven to within sight of Moscow, would find itself trapped, not by Soviet armies, but by mud. Thick, bottomless, all-consuming mud that swallowed tanks, broke supply lines, and transformed the greatest invasion in history into a slow-motion catastrophe. This is the story of how German commanders ignored meteorology until nature itself became their most implacable enemy. How hubris, poor intelligence, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian geography turned tactical brilliance into strategic disaster. How the Rasputitsa, a phenomenon as predictable as the seasons, caught the Wehrmacht completely unprepared and began the long, grinding process of Germany's defeat on the Eastern Front. The planning for Operation Barbarossa, begun in earnest in December 1940, was meticulous in some ways and catastrophically negligent in others. German general staff officers produced mountains of intelligence on Soviet military dispositions, industrial capacity and transportation networks. They analysed terrain, calculated fuel requirements, and wargamed countless scenarios. What they didn't do, with any seriousness, was study Russian weather patterns. This wasn't simple oversight. It was systematic institutional blindness rooted in both arrogance and ideology. The German military establishment viewed the Soviet Union through a lens distorted by Nazi racial theories and their own recent successes. If Untermenschen, subhumans in their twisted ideology, could survive and fight in these conditions, then surely the superior German soldier could do so even better. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, exemplified this attitude in his diary entry from January 1941. He wrote that Russian roads were primitive but manageable, that the Soviet climate was harsh but no worse than a German winter, and that German engineering and discipline would overcome any environmental obstacles. His analysis of weather conditions took up less than half a page in a planning document exceeding 1,000 pages. The few voices of caution were systematically sidelined. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Küstring, German military attaché to Moscow from 1931 to 1939, submitted a detailed report on Russian road conditions and seasonal weather patterns. His document, running to 87 pages with meteorological charts and soil composition analyses, explicitly warned about Rasputitsa. The period, Küstring wrote, typically begins in mid-October and can last anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks, depending on the severity of autumn rains and the timing of the first hard freeze. During Rasputitsa, unpaved roads become completely impassable to wheeled vehicles and extremely difficult even for tracked vehicles. The sticky clay mud can accumulate on vehicle tracks to the point where they lose traction entirely. Küstring's report was filed and forgotten. When his name came up in planning meetings, staff officers dismissed him as having gone native, having spent too much time among the Russians and absorbed their defeatist mentality. After all, the German army had just defeated the French, whose military theorists had been considered the world's finest. What could Russian mud do that French fortifications hadn't? Major General Hans von Greifenberg, chief of operations for the Eastern Front, did include weather contingencies in his planning, but they were optimistic to the point of fantasy. His timeline called for the destruction of the Soviet army west of the Dnieper River by August, the capture of Leningrad and Moscow by September, and consolidation of the eastern territories before the onset of winter. The autumn rains were mentioned only briefly as a potential minor inconvenience that might slow operations for a week or two. The possibility that Rasputitsa could halt operations entirely was never seriously considered. Even more damning was the complete failure to study historical precedents. The German army had fought in Russia during World War I. Thousands of veterans of that conflict were still alive, many still serving. Their memoirs and after-action reports contained detailed descriptions of the mud conditions. General Max Hoffmann, who had served as Chief of Staff for German forces on the Eastern Front in the First World War, published a memoir in 1924 that devoted an entire chapter to the Rasputitsa. He described roads that disappeared under 2 feet of liquid mud, supply wagons that required 20 horses to move loads that normally needed 4, and infantry who marched for hours without advancing more than a mile or 2. Hoffmann concluded his chapter with a warning. Any military operation in Russia must be timed to avoid the autumn mud season entirely. There is no supply system, no logistics plan, no tactical brilliance that can overcome the Rasputitsa. It is an absolute barrier to mobile warfare. This memoir sat in German military libraries, catalogued and available. There's no evidence that any of the senior officers planning Barbarossa read it. The intelligence failure extended to basic meteorological data. The German Weather Service had extensive records of European climate patterns, including some data from Western Russia. But the invasion would penetrate deep into the Soviet interior, into regions where German meteorologists had limited information. Requests for detailed weather data were submitted to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, in early 1941. The responses were superficial at best. One report noted that Russia experienced significant autumn rainfall, but provided no analysis of what this meant for military operations. Another mentioned that Russian roads were generally poor, but didn't explain the soil composition that made them uniquely vulnerable to wet weather. The most detailed weather intelligence came from the Luftwaffe's Meteorological Service, which had been analysing Soviet weather patterns to plan bombing operations. Their reports, largely ignored by the army, contained ominous data. October rainfall in the operational zone averaged 50 to 75 millimetres, with some regions receiving over 100 millimetres. The soil in much of western Russia and Ukraine was heavy clay with poor drainage. The combination of clay soil, flat terrain with minimal natural drainage, and heavy autumn rainfall created perfect conditions for Rasputitsa. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, the weather seemed to validate German assumptions. The summer of 1941 was warm and relatively dry. German columns raced across Russian territory on roads that, while primitive by Western European standards, were firm enough for tanks and trucks. The blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so brilliantly in Poland and France worked just as well in the first months in Russia. By September, Panzer spearheads had driven 600 miles into Soviet territory. Leningrad was under siege. Kiev had fallen. Army Group Center was positioning for the final drive on Moscow. The weather, far from being an obstacle, had been nearly perfect. Then October arrived. The first rains came on October 6, 1941, falling across the entire central front. They were heavy, cold autumn storms that lasted for days. Within 48 hours, the first reports of road difficulties began arriving at Army Group Center headquarters. Supply trucks were getting stuck. Columns were slowing. Nothing alarming yet, just the usual friction of military operations. By October 10th, the situation had deteriorated noticeably. Guderian's Panzer Group 2, driving toward Tula south of Moscow, reported that road conditions were significantly impeding movement. Tank recovery vehicles were being used to pull supply trucks out of mud holes. Infantry divisions were falling behind there. Mechanized spearheads because marching troops simply couldn't keep pace through the deteriorating roads. General Gunther von Klug, commanding 4th Army, sent a message to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, that should have triggered alarm. Road conditions are becoming critical. Wheeled vehicles are experiencing severe difficulties. Request immediate allocation of additional recovery vehicles and consideration of operational pause until roads improve. Von Bock's response was characteristic of the German command's refusal to accept meteorological reality. Push forward with all available forces. Road difficulties are temporary and will be resolved with harder ground or engineering solutions. The advance on Moscow will not be delayed by mud. But the mud was just beginning. October 12th brought even heavier rains. The dirt roads that comprised over 90% of the Russian road network began to disintegrate. What had been dirt tracks became ribbons of thick, sticky mud that in places measured 3 feet deep. The German army was discovering what Russian peasants had known for centuries. The soil of the Russian plain, particularly in the agricultural heartland, was composed of a fine-grained clay that, when wet, achieved a consistency somewhere between thick batter and wet concrete. It stuck to everything. It accumulated on vehicle tracks and wheels until they lost all traction. It sucked boots off soldiers' feet. It swallowed vehicles whole. Sergeant Heinrich Harper, serving with the 6th Infantry Division, described the conditions in his diary. "We are no longer fighting the Russians, we are fighting the mud." I watched a supply truck sink to its axles in less than 20 seconds. The driver tried to accelerate and the wheels just churned, digging deeper. We spent 3 hours with 40 men trying to extract it. We failed. The truck is still there, its cargo of ammunition desperately needed but unreachable. Men are discarding equipment because they cannot carry it through the mud. I saw soldiers throw away spare ammunition, extra rations, even their greatcoats because the energy required to carry them through this soup is too great. We advance perhaps 5 kilometers per day. At this rate, Moscow might as well be on the moon. The mechanical impact on German vehicles was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht's mechanized forces relied heavily on half-tracks and wheeled vehicles. The famous Panzer divisions that had terrified Europe contained thousands of trucks, cars and motorcycles for every tank. These wheeled vehicles, superb on European roads, were helpless in Russian mud. Half-tracks, with their combination of front wheels and rear tracks, fared somewhat better, but still struggled. The front wheels would dig into the mud while the rear tracks churned uselessly. Even fully tracked vehicles, the tanks themselves, faced serious problems. The narrow tracks of German tanks designed for European conditions created high ground pressure. In just mud, they sank deep and lost traction. Worse, the mud would pack into the road wheels and drive sprockets, sometimes freezing there overnight and rendering the tanks immobile come morning. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Eberbach, commanding a Panzer regiment, reported on October 15th that his unit's operational readiness had dropped from 85% to 35%, not due to enemy action, but because of mechanical failures caused by mud ingestion into engines, transmissions and running gear. His maintenance crews were working around the clock, but for every vehicle they repaired, 2 more broke down. The supply system, the logistical marvel that had sustained the German advance for 4 months, began to collapse. The Wehrmacht's logistics were built around railroads for strategic movement and trucks for tactical distribution, but the Soviet rail system used a different gauge than European railways, requiring either conversion of the rail lines or transshipment of supplies at the gauge change points. Both options were time-consuming, and now the final leg of supply distribution, the truck transport from railheads to combat units, was failing. Supply trucks that normally made the journey from railhead to frontline units in a few hours were taking days. Many never arrived at all, stuck hopelessly in mud somewhere along the route. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as vehicles struggled through the mire. Trucks that normally achieved 4 or 5 kilometers per litre were getting less than 1 kilometer per litre in mud conditions. This created a vicious circle. More fuel was needed to move supplies, but the fuel itself couldn't be moved because the trucks carrying it were stuck in mud. By October 20th, frontline German units were beginning to experience critical shortages. Panzer divisions were reporting fuel stocks at 30% of authorized levels. Infantry divisions were down to half rations. Artillery units were limiting fire missions to conserve ammunition. Medical supplies were dangerously low. The human cost was mounting. German soldiers, equipped and trained for mobile warfare, were breaking down under the strain of fighting mud. The physical exhaustion of marching through knee-deep muck day after day was devastating. Units reported increasing numbers of men simply collapsing from exhaustion, unable to continue. Medical officers began seeing cases of a condition they called trench foot, despite the fact that this was supposedly a mobile war, not trench warfare. Soldiers' feet, constantly wet and cold, were developing severe infections and tissue damage. The German boot, designed for European conditions, was not waterproof. Soldiers were marching in boots full of water and mud, their feet never dry. In some units, up to 20% of men were unable to march due to foot problems. The psychological impact was perhaps even more damaging than the physical. German soldiers, convinced of their superiority, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology that proclaimed their racial supremacy were being defeated by mud. The cognitive dissonance was severe. How could the master race be stopped by weather? Corporal Helmut Pabst wrote in a letter that was later intercepted by Soviet intelligence, "We have conquered Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece. We have defeated armies that outnumbered us. We have overcome obstacles that military theorists said were insurmountable. And now we sit, helpless, watching our vehicles sink into mud while the objective lies just over the horizon. The Russians don't need to fight us. The land itself is fighting us, and we cannot shoot mud or bayonet rain." Morale began to crack. The invincibility complex that had carried German forces through 2 years of victories was dissolving in the Russian mud. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were adapting far better to the conditions. The Red Army, drawn largely from rural populations, understood mud in a way Germans never could. Soviet soldiers knew how to move through it, how to avoid the worst areas, how to identify firmish ground that could support weight. Soviet vehicles were designed for Russian conditions. The T-34 tank, with its wide tracks and Christie suspension, maintained mobility in conditions that immobilized German panzers. Soviet trucks, simpler and more rugged than German equivalents, fared better in the mud. And critically, the Soviets had horses, hundreds of thousands of horses. German military planning had emphasized mechanization, viewing horse-drawn transport as obsolete. But in the Rasputitsa, horses proved far more effective than trucks. A horse could pull a wagon through mud that would stop a truck. Horses didn't require fuel that had to be transported hundreds of miles. Horses could eat hay and grain procured locally. The Red Army supply system, primitive by German standards, was actually better suited to the conditions. Soviet logistics relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons and human porters. These methods were slow but reliable. While German trucks sat immobilized in mud, Soviet supply columns continued moving. Stalin and the Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, recognized the opportunity. Weather reports indicated the Rasputitsa would continue for at least 2 more weeks, possibly longer. German momentum had been stopped cold. This was the moment to counterattack. On October 25th, Soviet forces launched coordinated counterattacks along the entire Central Front. Fresh divisions brought from Siberia, informed by intelligence that Japan would not attack in the east, hit German positions that were undersupplied, exhausted, and psychologically battered. The German line didn't collapse. The Wehrmacht was too professional for that, but it did bend. Ground that had been captured at great cost was abandoned. Units withdrew to more defensible positions, sacrificing miles of advance to consolidate their lines. At Army Group Center headquarters, Field Marshal von Bock was facing the impossible. His orders from Hitler were unambiguous: take Moscow before winter. The Führer had made it clear that failure was unacceptable, but von Bock's forces were stuck. They couldn't advance through the mud, they couldn't be supplied through the mud, and now they were being attacked by an enemy that seemed immune to the conditions that paralyzed German forces. Von Bock's situation, reports to OKH, Oberkommando des Heers, the Army High Command, became increasingly desperate. He reported on October 28th that his forces required at minimum a 2-week operational pause to consolidate supply lines, repair vehicles, and rest exhausted troops. The response from Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, reflected the complete disconnect between headquarters and reality. Pause is not acceptable. The Führer has ordered the capture of Moscow before the onset of winter. All available forces will continue the advance, overcome local difficulties through superior German willpower and tactical skill. This order, sent from headquarters hundreds of miles behind the front, where roads were marginally better and the true conditions could be ignored, represented the crystallization of German command failure. They were ordering the impossible and blaming their subordinates when reality intervened. But then, in early November, nature offered the Germans a reprieve. The temperature dropped, the rain turned to snow and the mud began to freeze. Within days the ground hardened. Roads that had been impassable became solid again. German vehicles that had been stuck for weeks were freed as the mud around them froze solid. The Rasputitsa was over. The German command's response to this meteorological gift was characteristic. They learned nothing. Von Bock, Guderian, Hoth, all the senior commanders interpreted the freezing ground as vindication of their determination to push forward. See, their attitude suggested, If we had just been more determined, more willing to suffer, we could have overcome the mud. The possibility that they had simply gotten lucky with an early freeze was not considered. The pause in Rasputitsa was temporary. They were informed by their meteorologists, but again, this information was largely ignored. The new focus was on racing to take Moscow before winter truly set in. On November 15th, the German offensive resumed. With frozen ground providing solid footing, Panzer units once again demonstrated their tactical brilliance. Advances that had been measured in kilometres per week during the mud seasons suddenly leapt to kilometres per day. By late November, advanced German units were within 20 miles of Moscow. Reconnaissance troops could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed within grasp. Then the temperature dropped further. The mild frost that had ended the Rasputitsa gave way to genuine Russian winter. By December, temperatures were regularly hitting -20, -30 Celsius, and the German army discovered they had failed to prepare for winter warfare just as catastrophically as they had failed to prepare for mud. The winter crisis is a separate story of German unpreparedness, but it's worth noting that it stemmed from the same institutional failures that had left them vulnerable to Rasputitsa. Overconfidence, poor intelligence, and systematic dismissal of warnings combined to create catastrophe. The Rasputitsa returned in spring 1942. German commanders, having experienced it once, were more prepared this time. Units were positioned to minimize supply line lengths. Stockpiles were built up in advance. Engineers prepared corduroy roads, logs laid side by side to create a semi-solid surface through muddy areas. But preparation only mitigated the impact. It didn't eliminate it. The spring 1942 Rasputitsa, lasting from mid-March through late April, once again brought German mobile operations to a virtual standstill. Planned offensives were delayed. Supply difficulties resumed. The pattern would repeat every autumn and spring for the remainder of the war. German forces in Russia would face two enemies, the Red Army and the weather. They never truly mastered either. The failure to account for Rasputitsa in planning for Operation Barbarossa was symptomatic of larger failures in German strategic thinking. The Nazi regime's ideology blinded them to practical realities. Their contempt for Slavic peoples extended to contempt for the land those people inhabited and the conditions they endured. German military culture, for all its tactical proficiency, had a fatal flaw at the strategic level. It confused tactical excellence with strategic invulnerability. The German army could execute brilliant operations, but it consistently failed to understand the larger context in which those operations occurred. The Rasputitsa was predictable. It happened every autumn and every spring. Russian officers, peasants, even children knew it was coming and knew what it meant. But German generals, operating from their ideological and cultural bubble, dismissed this knowledge as irrelevant. How could primitive Russians know something that superior Germans didn't? The intelligence failure was compounded by institutional politics within the German military. Different branches competed for resources and prestige. The Luftwaffe hoarded weather intelligence for its own purposes. The army's logistics branch was consistently overruled by operational commanders who insisted that willpower could overcome material constraints. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was more focused on espionage and political intrigue than on mundane matters like soil composition and rainfall patterns. Hitler himself bore significant responsibility. His interference in military planning was constant and often capricious. But on the question of weather and logistics, he was simply indifferent. When presented with concerns about seasonal conditions, he dismissed them as defeatist thinking. The Führer's will, he believed, could overcome any obstacle. This magical thinking permeated the entire command structure. The specific meteorological phenomenon of Rasputitsa deserves closer examination. The word itself is Russian, literally meaning the time of no roads. It refers specifically to the biannual period when dirt roads become impassable due to mud. The autumn Rasputitsa, which devastated the German advance in 1941, occurs when autumn rains saturate soil that hasn't yet frozen. The soil in much of western Russia and Ukraine is loess-derived, meaning it comes from very fine-grained sediment deposited during ice ages. This soil has several properties that make it uniquely terrible for military operations. First, it has high clay content. Clay particles are extremely fine and have a large surface area relative to their volume. When water is added, each particle becomes surrounded by a thin film of water. The result is a substance that flows like a very thick liquid, but has enough cohesion to stick to everything it touches. Second, the terrain is relatively flat with poor natural drainage. In more mountainous regions, water runs off into streams and rivers relatively quickly. On the Russian plain, water has nowhere to go. It sits on the surface or just below it, turning the top foot or two of soil into a quagmire. Third, there's an absence of stone. In Western Europe, roads, even unpaved ones, often have a substrate of gravel or stone. In much of Russia, there's no local stone available. Roads are simply cleared earth, with nothing to provide structure when they get wet. The result is a substance that has no real analogue in Western Europe. It's not mud in the sense that a European soldier would understand. It's something far worse. When you step in it, your boot sinks 6 inches, sometimes a foot. When you lift your boot, the suction pulls it off your foot unless you've tied it very tightly. When vehicles try to drive through it, their wheels or tracks spin uselessly, digging deeper rather than gaining traction. When it gets on vehicles or equipment, it sticks with tenacious grip, adding hundreds of pounds of extra weight. And it's everywhere. During the peak of Rasputitsa, essentially every unpaved surface becomes this substance. The few paved roads that existed in 1941, Russia became impossibly congested as all traffic tried to use them simultaneously. The German army's vehicles were particularly ill-suited to these conditions. German tanks of 1941, primarily Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, had relatively narrow tracks. This was a deliberate design choice. Narrow tracks reduced weight, improved fuel efficiency on European roads, and simplified logistics. But narrow tracks meant high ground pressure, meaning each square centimetre of track was supporting more weight. In mud, this meant sinking deeper. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34, had much wider tracks. The T-34's tracks were 16 inches wide compared to 12 inches for the Panzer III. This seemingly small difference translated to significantly lower ground pressure and better performance in soft ground. The Germans would eventually learn this lesson and apply it to later tank designs. But in 1941, their entire panzer force was trapped in obsolete design paradigms. German trucks faced even worse problems. The majority of German trucks in 1941 were commercial designs, militarized civilian vehicles. They had relatively light construction, narrow tyres, and two-wheel drive. In mud, they were helpless. Two-wheel drive meant that when the drive wheels lost traction, the vehicle was stuck. No amount of engine power could overcome the lack of grip. Soviet trucks like the American Studebaker and GMC trucks that would arrive via Lend-Lease were more likely to have all-wheel drive and heavy-duty construction. They were slower on roads and less fuel-efficient, but far more capable in difficult terrain. The German half-track, vehicles like the Scumfsee 251, represented a compromise between wheeled and tracked mobility. They performed better than pure wheeled vehicles in mud, but were expensive to produce and mechanically complex. More importantly, there were never enough of them. German infantry and supply units relied overwhelmingly on wheeled vehicles that simply couldn't cope with Rasputitsa. Perhaps the most damning evidence of German negligence regarding weather conditions comes from captured documents and post-war interrogations. After the war, Allied intelligence teams interviewed surviving German officers about the planning and execution of Operation Barbarossa. The transcripts reveal a consistent pattern. When asked about weather planning, officers almost universally acknowledged that it had been inadequate. When asked why this was so, answers varied, but certain themes recurred. Some blamed Hitler's insistence on launching the invasion in June 1941, despite military advice to wait until 1942. The compressed timeline, they argued, meant that detailed planning for contingencies like autumn weather was squeezed out. Others blamed the chaos of the Nazi command structure, where overlapping jurisdictions and personal rivalries meant that no single entity was responsible for comprehensive logistics planning. Still others pointed to a cultural factor. German military education emphasized operational art, the planning and execution of campaigns and battles. It relatively neglected logistics, which was seen as a technical specialty rather than a core military skill. One former staff officer, whose name was redacted in the declassified documents, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We believed we would win before autumn. We believed the Soviet Union would collapse like France had collapsed. We planned for a 6 to 8 week campaign, not a multi-year war of attrition. In that context, why would we plan for autumn weather? We didn't think we would still be there. This reveals the fundamental strategic failure. Operation Barbarossa was planned as a knockout blow. Single decisive campaign that would destroy Soviet military power and force capitulation. When this didn't happen, when the Soviets proved able to trade space for time and absorb catastrophic losses while continuing to fight, the entire German strategic concept collapsed, and they had no backup plan. The impact of the autumn 1941 Rasputitsa on German operations cannot be overstated. It's often said that the German army was stopped by Russian winter, and while this is true, it's incomplete. The German army was first stopped by Russian autumn. The Rasputitsa cost them the month of October, arguably the most crucial month of the entire campaign. In early October, German forces were advancing rapidly toward Moscow. Soviet defences, while determined, were still being overwhelmed by superior German tactical skill. If the advance had continued at early October pace, Moscow might well have fallen by early November. Instead, the Rasputitsa imposed a pause. This gave the Soviets time to rush reinforcements to the Moscow defence perimeter. It gave them time to construct field fortifications. Most importantly, it gave them time to relocate critical industries eastward, beyond German reach. The pause also had a severe psychological impact on German forces. The illusion of invincibility, already strained by heavier-than-expected Soviet resistance, shattered completely during the mud season. German soldiers had been told they were fighting inferior Slavs in a primitive country, yet they were being defeated by mud, something the supposedly inferior Soviets seemed able to handle better. This cognitive dissonance contributed to declining morale that would plague German forces for the remainder of the war. There's a counterfactual question that military historians continue to debate. What if Operation Barbarossa had been launched earlier, say in May, instead of June? Would this have allowed German forces to reach their objectives before the autumn Rasputitsa? The arguments are complex, but the consensus is that earlier launch would have presented different problems without necessarily solving the fundamental ones. May would have meant launching during the spring Rasputitsa, facing the same mud conditions that halted operations in October. The roads needed to be dry for the initial advance. Waiting for the spring mud to clear meant waiting until June. Could the invasion have been launched in 1940 instead of 1941? Again, the consensus is no. Germany needed time after defeating France to refit forces, build up supply stockpiles, and deploy forces eastward. The decision to invade in June 1941 was probably optimal given Germany's constraints. The real failure wasn't the timing of the invasion. It was the failure to plan for a campaign lasting beyond the summer. The assumption of quick victory was the fatal error, and it pervaded every aspect of German planning. For the soldiers on the ground, the Rasputitsa was an immediate visceral nightmare. Accounts from German troops during October and November 1941 describe an almost surreal horror. Lieutenant Heinrich Hauser, serving with the 267th Infantry Division, kept a detailed diary that survived the war. His entries from mid-October describe a descent into Kafkaesque absurdity. October 15th. The road has disappeared. Not covered by mud, disappeared. There is no longer any distinction between road and field. Everything is the same brown liquid. We are supposed to advance 10 kilometers today. We advance 400 meters before stopping for the night. The men are becoming animals. We no longer speak of military objectives or tactics. We speak only of mud, how to get through mud, how to sleep in mud, how to eat without getting mud in your food. It's impossible, by the way. Everything tastes of mud. October 18th. Found a soldier from the 268th Division wandering alone. He had been separated from his unit 3 days ago. He had been trying to walk back to the rear, but he no longer knows where rear is. In the mud, everything looks the same. He was crying. A German soldier crying, not from fear of the enemy, but from hopelessness in the face of mud. I gave him what food I could spare and pointed him westward. I don't know if he made it. October 21st. Orders to advance were rescinded, not because of enemy action, because the division's supply trucks cannot reach us. We have ammunition for perhaps 1 day of intense combat. We have rations for 3 days. After that, nothing. The regimental commander has requested air supply. This is optimistic. The airfields are as muddy as the roads. Half the Luftwaffe's aircraft in our sector are grounded because the airfields have turned into bogs. We sit in mud and wait for supplies that aren't coming so we can resume an advance that isn't possible. Absurd. October 25th. Soviet counterattack. They came out of the mud like ghosts. How do they move through this? They're carrying the same equipment we are, carrying the same weight, yet they move through the mud while we can barely stand in it. We held our position, but only because they withdrew after a brief firefight. If they had pressed the attack, I don't know if we could have retreated. Can you retreat through mud? October 30th. 3 men from my company have frozen to death. Temperatures dropped last night. This should be good news. It means the mud will freeze. But the men, exhausted from fighting mud for 3 weeks, wet to the skin for days, couldn't survive the sudden cold. They went to sleep and didn't wake up. We buried them in the mud. There's nothing else to do with bodies here. Similar accounts appear in hundreds of diaries and letters from German soldiers during this period. The recurring themes are physical exhaustion, psychological desperation, and a growing sense that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't defeat. Soviet accounts from the same period tell a different story. While Red Army forces were also suffering, their suffering was of a different character. They were losing battles, taking heavy casualties, but they weren't psychologically defeated by the conditions. Major Ivan Shabalin, commanding a rifle battalion in the 32nd Rifle Division, kept notes that were later compiled into a memoir. His October 1941 entries describe the Rasputitsa from the Soviet perspective. The Germans are stuck. Our scouts report their columns are backed up for kilometers, vehicles helpless in the mud. This is our advantage, perhaps our only advantage. They have better tanks, better planes, better training. But we have mud, and we know how to use it. We move at night, using paths through the forest that their maps don't show. Paths that local peasants have used for generations, routes that avoid the worst mud. We hit them and disappear before they can organize pursuit. They cannot follow us through the mud. During the day we fortify. Digging is difficult in this suit, but we manage. The Germans cannot attack effectively. Their artillery cannot move into position. Their tanks cannot maneuver. We wait for the freeze. When the ground hardens, they will come again, stronger. But we will be ready, and they will be exhausted from fighting the mud. This contrast in perspectives illustrates a fundamental difference. Soviet forces viewed the Rasputitsa as a natural phenomenon to be endured and exploited. German forces viewed it as an obstacle that superior will should overcome. One approach was realistic, the other was not. The logistical mathematics of the Rasputitsa were catastrophic for Germany. A German Panzer division in 1941 required approximately 300 tons of supplies per day to maintain operations. This included fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and other necessities. Delivering 300 tons required roughly 100 trucks, making round trips from supply dumps to the division. Under normal conditions, with paved or dry dirt roads, each truck could make 1 round trip per day. During the Rasputitsa, trucks that could move at all took 3 to 5 days to make the same round trip. This meant that to deliver the same amount of supplies required 3 to 5 times as many trucks. But those additional trucks weren't available. Worse, the trucks themselves were consuming far more fuel to struggle through the mud, and that additional fuel also had to be transported. The entire supply system entered a death spiral. Less supply reached the front, which meant operations slowed, which meant units stayed in position longer, which meant they consumed supplies longer, which increased demand. The German army tried various solutions. They attempted to build corduroy roads, laying logs side by side to create a solid surface. This worked in some locations, but the logistical requirement was enormous. 1 kilometre of corduroy road required roughly 2,000 logs. Each log had to be cut, transported and laid. In the forested regions of Russia, timber was available, but cutting and moving it required labour and time. Pioneer battalions, the German, Army's combat engineers, worked around the clock building corduroy roads, but they couldn't keep up with demand. They tried concentrating traffic on selected routes, turning a few roads into main supply arteries and abandoning others. This reduced the dispersion of logistics effort, but it created new problems. The concentrated traffic on selected roads tore them up faster. A road that might have supported light traffic became completely destroyed by the passage of hundreds of heavy vehicles. They tried using captured Soviet horses and wagons. This worked better than might be expected. Horse-drawn transport, while slow, was reliable in mud. But the Germans hadn't planned for horse logistics. They didn't have sufficient fodder stockpiled. They didn't have enough veterinary support. They didn't have drivers trained in managing horse teams. Using captured Soviet transport on a large scale would have required preparing for it months in advance, something that hadn't been done. The Luftwaffe attempted aerial resupply, dropping supplies by parachute or landing transport aircraft near frontline units. This provided some relief, but the scale was insufficient. The Luftwaffe had roughly 500 transport aircraft available for the entire Eastern Front. Even if all of them flew multiple sorties per day, which they couldn't, they could deliver perhaps 1,000 tons of supplies daily. The ground forces required over 10,000 tons per day. Aerial supply couldn't replace ground logistics, it could only supplement it in crisis situations. Moreover, the airfields themselves were affected by mud. German aircraft operated from grass airfields, many of them hastily constructed or captured Soviet facilities. When the Rasputitsa hit, these airfields turned into mud pits. Aircraft couldn't take off because their wheels sank into the soft ground. Planes that did manage to get airborne returned to find their airfields unusable for landing. The Luftwaffe's effectiveness dropped precipitously during October 1941, not because of Soviet air defences, but because their own airfields were unusable. The Germans attempted to lay steel matting, prefabricated metal plates that could be laid on soft ground to create temporary runways. This helped, but required vast quantities of steel matting that had to be transported to forward airfields, which meant using trucks, which meant competing for the limited functional transport with frontline supply needs. Every solution created new problems. Every workaround had costs that rippled through the entire system, and underlying everything was the fundamental failure. Nobody had planned for this. The contingencies didn't exist. The stockpiles weren't in place. The procedures hadn't been developed. The German army was improvising desperately, trying to overcome through battlefield ingenuity what should have been addressed in the planning phase. By early November 1941, when the ground froze and operations could resume, the cumulative impact of the Rasputitsa had fundamentally altered the strategic situation. The German army had lost a month of campaigning time. They had consumed supplies without advancing. They had exhausted troops without achieving objectives. They had lost the psychological edge that came from seemingly unstoppable momentum. Most critically, they had given the Soviet Union time. Time to mobilize reserves, time to fortify defenses, time to relocate industry, time to prepare for winter warfare. That time, purchased with Russian mud, may have saved Moscow and with it the Soviet war effort. The spring 1942 Rasputitsa, occurring from mid-March through late April, demonstrated that German commanders had learned some lessons, but not enough. This time, units were warned in advance. Supply stockpiles were built up beforehand. Engineers prepared corduroy roads and improved logistics routes. Divisions were positioned to minimize supply line lengths, but all the preparation in the world couldn't change the fundamental reality. When the spring thaw came and the ground turned to mud, mobile operations became impossible. The German spring offensive, intended to capitalize on winter gains, was delayed by 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks allowed Soviet forces to recover and prepare their own operations. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most gifted operational commander, faced the spring Rasputitsa while planning the assault on Sevastopol in 1942. His memoirs, written after the war, contain a remarkably frank assessment of the weather's impact. I had studied the meteorological reports. I knew the Rasputitsa was coming. I adjusted my timeline accordingly, and still, when it arrived, it exceeded my worst projections. The Crimean Peninsula, with its mixture of clay soil and minimal road network, became essentially impassable. My offensive, carefully planned with what I believed were adequate reserves and supply arrangements, simply stopped. Not stopped by enemy action, stopped by physics. No amount of tactical skill, no brilliance of manoeuvre, no superiority of German training and equipment could overcome the simple fact that vehicles cannot move through liquid mud. I learned a lesson that winter that should have been obvious from the start. In Russia, weather is not a factor in planning. It is the primary factor. Everything else, enemy dispositions, logistics, objectives, must be subordinated to the weather timeline. This is not how German military doctrine taught us to think. We were trained to believe that the will of the commander, executed through the skill of the troops, could overcome obstacles. But weather is not an obstacle in the conventional sense. It is an absolute constraint. You cannot fight it. You cannot outmaneuver it. You can only plan around it. Manstein's insight, gained through bitter experience, should have been obvious from the beginning. Russian generals understood it instinctively. Soviet operational planning routinely incorporated detailed weather analysis. Offensives were timed to avoid the Rasputitsa periods. Defensive positions were chosen with weather in mind. Supply routes were selected based on their performance in mud. This wasn't sophisticated meteorology. It was basic common sense, informed by centuries of Russian experience with their own climate. But German commanders, products of a military culture that emphasized willpower and tactical brilliance, struggled to accept that something as mundane as weather could be decisive. The autumn 1942 Rasputitsa affected operations across the entire Eastern Front, but its impact was most dramatically felt in the Caucasus campaign. German forces driving toward the Baku oil fields found themselves trapped by mud in mountainous terrain where roads were already primitive. Army Group A stretched along hundreds of miles of supply lines through difficult terrain, ground to a halt in October 1942. The forces that might have captured Baku and secured Germany's oil supply for the war were instead stuck in mud, unable to advance or adequately resupply. The pause gave Soviet forces time to stabilize defenses. When the ground froze and German operations resumed, Soviet reserves had arrived. The opportunity was lost. Meanwhile, further north, the Stalingrad campaign was entering its critical phase. The Rasputitsa affected operations there as well, complicating German supply lines at precisely the moment when the Sixth Army needed maximum logistical support. The culmination came in late November, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, the encirclement of Stalingrad. German forces, exhausted from months of combat and weakened by supply difficulties caused in part by autumn mud, couldn't effectively respond to the Soviet breakthrough. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had many causes, but the logistical weaknesses exposed and exacerbated by the Rasputitsa were among them. By 1943, German forces in Russia had developed procedures and tactics specifically for dealing with Rasputitsa conditions. Units maintained detailed records of road conditions, updated daily. Engineer battalions pre-positioned materials for road construction. Supply units developed rotation systems to keep trucks moving. Intelligence sections monitored weather forecasts obsessively. But procedural improvements couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic problem. The German army was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with greater resources, fighting in conditions that negated German advantages in training and equipment quality. The Rasputitsa was a twice-yearly reminder of this reality. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding 4th Army during 1943, instituted what he called Mud Doctrine for his command. His orders, distributed to all subordinate units, represented the mature German understanding of Rasputitsa conditions. All offensive operations will cease during confirmed Rasputitsa periods. Defensive positions will be fortified and supplied to maximum possible extent before the onset of mud season. Supply convoys will be reduced to essential items only. Fuel and ammunition take priority. All non-essential vehicles will be withdrawn to rear areas where road conditions are better. Infantry movement will be minimized. Troops will remain in fortified positions where possible. Engineers will focus on maintaining supply routes, not on supporting offensive operations. Air supply will be requested only for units in critical situations, units that are cut off or critically undersupplied. All personnel will be issued foot care materials and instructed in preventing trench foot and cold weather injuries. Morale maintenance is a command priority. Troops must understand that the operational pause is due to weather, not enemy action. This doctrine represented a complete reversal from the 1941 approach of trying to fight through the mud. By 1943, German commanders accepted that the Rasputitsa imposed operational pauses and planning had to accommodate this reality. But acceptance came too late. The strategic initiative had already been lost. The accumulated impact of multiple Rasputitsa periods had contributed to German exhaustion and Soviet recovery. Soviet forces, meanwhile, had learned to exploit the Rasputitsa offensively. Rather than simply enduring the mud seasons, Red Army planners actively used them to shape operations. Major offensives were often timed to culminate just before the Rasputitsa, knowing that German counterattacks would be severely hampered by mud. Defensive operations took advantage of the fact that German mobile forces were effectively immobilized during mud season. Soviet cavalry and infantry, less dependent on mechanized transport, retained greater mobility than their German counterparts. The most sophisticated Soviet exploitation of Rasputitsa conditions came during the planning of Operation Barbarossa, the massive offensive that destroyed Army Group Center in summer 1944. Soviet planners specifically timed preliminary operations to occur during the spring 1944 Rasputitsa, fixing German forces in place and preventing them from redeploying. When the ground dried and the main offensive launched in June, German forces were out of position and unable to respond effectively. The Rasputitsa had been weaponized. German intelligence reports from 1944 show an almost desperate attention to weather forecasting. Meteorological sections were expanded. Specialized weather reconnaissance flights were conducted. Local informants were questioned about seasonal patterns. But all this intelligence couldn't change the fundamental facts. The Rasputitsa would come every autumn and every spring. It would last for weeks. During that time, mobile warfare would be impossible. These facts, known with certainty, could be planned around but not avoided. The human cost of the Rasputitsa extended beyond immediate combat casualties. German soldiers who survived the war carried physical and psychological scars from their struggles with Russian mud. Medical records show elevated rates of chronic foot problems, joint diseases, and respiratory ailments among Eastern Front veterans. Many attributed these conditions to the weeks and months spent constantly wet and cold during mud seasons. The psychological impact was perhaps even more lasting. Veterans spoke of the helplessness they felt, watching their vehicles sink into mud, seeing their supplies fail to arrive, knowing the objective was close but unreachable. This sense of helplessness was alien to German military culture, which emphasized action, initiative, and overcoming obstacles through determination. One particularly revealing document emerged from post-war archives. In March 1944, the Operations Section of Army Group Center prepared an internal study titled Influence of Seasonal Weather on Operations, Lessons from 2 Years. The classified document was remarkably candid. The Rasputitsa represents the single greatest challenge to mobile operations on the Eastern Front, exceeding in impact both enemy action and supply difficulties. During mud seasons, combat effectiveness of mechanized units drops by 75 to 90%. Infantry effectiveness drops by 40 to 60%. Supply throughput decreases by 60 to 80%. These figures represent averages across multiple Rasputitsa periods and multiple units. The strategic impact of these effectiveness reductions cannot be overstated. Each Rasputitsa period costs approximately 4 to 6 weeks of operational time. Over the course of a year, this represents 2 to 3 months when effective operations are impossible. This effectively shortens the campaigning season from 12 months to 9 to 10 months. For an attacker operating on extended supply lines in hostile territory, this is devastating. The report went on to make recommendations, most of which were never implemented due to Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Recommendation 1. All major offensives must be planned to conclude before the onset of autumn Rasputitsa. This requires beginning major operations no later than early July to ensure sufficient time for exploitation before October. Recommendation 2. The period from October through November and March through April should be treated as non-operational for planning purposes. Defensive postures should be assumed, and these periods should be used for rest, refitting, and training. Recommendation 3. Supply stockpiles must be positioned forward before each Rasputitsa period. Units cannot rely on continuous supply during mud seasons. They must have sufficient supplies pre-positioned to sustain operations for 6 to 8 weeks without resupply. Recommendation 4. Vehicle procurement must prioritize all-terrain capability over road speed. Current vehicles are optimized for European road networks that don't exist in Russia. Future vehicle designs must emphasize wide tracks, low ground pressure, and simple mechanics that can be maintained in primitive conditions. These recommendations, had they been implemented in 1941 before the invasion, might have significantly altered German operational effectiveness. Implemented in 1944, with Germany already on the strategic defensive and losing the war, they were largely irrelevant. The document stands as an epitaph for German strategic planning in Russia. Too little, too late. The final German experiences with Rasputitsa came during the retreat westward in 1944 and 1945. Now the mud worked against them in new ways. Retreating forces found that the same mud that had hampered their advances now hampered their withdrawals. Units trying to disengage and move west became stuck, vulnerable to Soviet pursuit. Supply columns trying to evacuate equipment and supplies found themselves trapped. In some cases, entire vehicle parks had to be abandoned because they couldn't be moved through the mud. The spring 1945 Rasputitsa, the last one German forces would experience in Russia, saw them in full retreat. Soviet forces, now thoroughly mechanized with American and British vehicles, provided through Lend-Lease, maintained pressure even during mud season. Studebaker and GMC trucks, designed for ruggedness rather than efficiency, performed far better in Russian conditions than German vehicles ever had. The final irony was that American industrial power, applied to solving the problem of Russian mud, had succeeded where German engineering had failed. After the war, captured German military documents were analysed extensively by Allied intelligence services. The Americans, in particular, were interested in German experiences with weather and terrain in Russia, as they contemplated potential future operations in similar conditions. The studies produced by the US Army's military history section included extensive interviews with German commanders about the Rasputitsa. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Kluge and later to Field Marshal Model, provided a comprehensive assessment during his interrogation. The mud, more than any other single factor, should have been accounted for in our planning. We knew Russia had primitive roads. We knew autumn brought rain. But we didn't understand what these facts meant in practical terms. We thought Russian roads were like French country roads, dirt tracks that become muddy but remain passable with care. Russian roads aren't roads in the Western sense. They're cleared paths through terrain. When it rains, they cease to exist. The mud isn't like European mud. It's a substance that behaves almost like quicksand. Vehicles don't just get stuck, they get swallowed. I saw a supply truck sink until only its roof remained visible. The driver had gotten out, fortunately, but the vehicle and its entire cargo were simply gone, consumed by mud. Blumentritt continued with an assessment that cut to the heart of the German failure. We Germans pride ourselves on our thoroughness, our attention to detail, our superior planning, yet we invaded the largest country in the world without adequately studying its weather. This wasn't an oversight. It was a fundamental failure of intelligence and planning. We were so convinced of our superiority, so certain that we would win quickly through tactical brilliance, that we didn't bother with mundane details like soil composition and seasonal rainfall. This arrogance cost us the war. Not alone, of course. We made many mistakes. But the failure to plan for the Rasputitsa, the dismissal of warnings about Russian weather, the assumption that German will could overcome Russian mud, these exemplified the arrogance that doomed us. Field Marshal von Manstein, in his memoirs published in 1955, devoted considerable space to the weather challenges in Russia. His analysis, written with the benefit of hindsight and without the pressures of wartime, was scathing in its criticism of German planning. The invasion of Russia was launched with inadequate intelligence, unrealistic timelines, and insufficient resources. Of these failures, the most inexcusable was our failure to account for weather. Weather in Russia isn't like weather in Germany. It doesn't arrive as occasional inconvenience. It arrives as absolute barrier to operations. The Rasputitsa doesn't slow operations. It stops them. This should have been understood from the beginning. Russian history is full of examples of armies being stopped by mud. Napoleon's retreat in 1812 was complicated by autumn mud. Our own armies in World War I faced the same conditions. Yet in 1941, we acted as if these historical examples were irrelevant, as if German superiority would exempt us from the laws of physics. The result was predictable. We were stopped, not by Soviet military power, though that was formidable, but by mud. The month we lost in October and November 1941 was the most critical month of the entire war. If we had taken Moscow in October, which was operationally possible if not for the mud, the war might have ended differently. Instead, we took Moscow in never. We never recovered the initiative. The meteorological data tells its own story. October 1941 saw above-average rainfall across western Russia. Moscow region received 71 millimeters of rain, well above the historical average of 45 millimeters. The Ukraine received over 80 millimeters in some areas. Combined with temperatures that remained above freezing until early November, conditions were ideal for prolonged Rasputitsa. The freeze, when it came in early November, was earlier than average, providing the Germans with a window to resume operations. But this was luck, not planning. If the freeze had come 2 weeks later, as it did in some years, The German offensive would have been stopped for an additional 2 weeks, and the attack on Moscow might not have been possible at all before deep winter set in. The spring 1942 Rasputitsa was even more severe. March and April 1942 were unusually wet across the entire Eastern Front. The thaw came late, and the subsequent rains were heavy. The mud season lasted nearly 8 weeks in some areas, from mid-March through early May. German operations planned for April had to be postponed until May, which in turn delayed summer operations. The cascade effect meant that the 1942 summer offensive began later than planned, which meant it was still ongoing when the autumn 1942 Rasputitsa arrived. The pattern repeated, with German forces trapped by mud at critical moments. One of the most comprehensive analyses of the Rasputitsa's impact came from the US Army's 1951 study, Weather as a Factor in the Failure of Operation Barbarossa. This classified study, based on captured German documents and interviews with German commanders, attempted to quantify the weather's impact on operations. The study concluded that the October-November 1941 Rasputitsa delayed the German offensive on Moscow by approximately 35 days. During this period, German forces advanced an average of less than 2 kilometers per day, compared to 15 to 20 kilometers per day before and after the mud season. The delay allowed the Soviet Union to move 27 divisions to the Moscow defense zone, construct over 3,000 kilometers of field fortifications, and relocate critical war industries beyond German reach. The study estimated that without the Rasputitsa delay, German forces would have reached Moscow's inner defences by mid-October with sufficient time and resources to conduct a siege operation before winter. The probability of Moscow falling under these circumstances was assessed at 60 to 70%. With the Rasputitsa delay, German forces reached Moscow's inner defences in late November, exhausted, undersupplied, and facing both Soviet reserves and the onset of winter. Under these circumstances, the probability of success was assessed at less than 10%. The study's conclusion was stark. The Rasputitsa did not cause the failure of Operation Barbarossa. The operation failed due to multiple factors, including underestimation of Soviet military power, overextended supply lines, inadequate resources, and poor strategic planning. However, the Rasputitsa was the proximate cause of the failure to capture Moscow in 1941. This failure eliminated Germany's best chance for a decisive victory in the East, and ensured that the war would become a prolonged attrition struggle that Germany could not win. The study recommended that future military operations in similar climates must incorporate detailed meteorological intelligence into planning at the highest levels. Weather must be treated not as a subordinate factor, but as a primary constraint on operations, equivalent to enemy forces or logistics. Soviet assessments of German performance regarding weather were less charitable. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, in his memoirs, was dismissive of German weather planning. The Germans came to Russia as tourists, not as soldiers prepared for serious war. They brought summer uniforms to a country where winter means death. They brought vehicles designed for autobahns to a country where roads are suggestions. They brought arrogance instead of intelligence. The Rasputitsa surprised them as completely as the winter surprised them. This tells you everything about their preparation. We knew the mud was coming. Every Russian knows this. The idea that a modern army would invade Russia without understanding Rasputitsa is almost incomprehensible. It would be like invading Africa without considering heat, or invading the Arctic without considering cold. Yet this is what they did. Zhukov's assessment, while harsh, was accurate. The German failure to account for Rasputitsa wasn't a minor planning oversight. It was a fundamental failure of strategic intelligence and planning. It reflected the Nazi regime's ideological blindness, the German military's cultural weaknesses, and the dangers of strategic overconfidence. The Rasputitsa of 1941 stands as one of history's clearest examples of how environmental factors can decisively shape military outcomes. The German army in October 1941 wasn't defeated by Soviet soldiers. It was defeated by physics, by the interaction of water, clay soil, and gravity. No amount of tactical skill, no superiority of training or equipment, no ideological fervour could overcome these physical realities. The lessons should have been obvious, but they weren't learned until it was too late. By the time German commanders fully understood and adapted to Rasputitsa conditions, the strategic situation had already turned irreversibly against them. The window of opportunity for decisive victory had closed, and Russian mud had helped close it. In the end, the story of German commanders ignoring the weather until the Rasputitsa stopped their army, isn't just a story about mud. It's a story about the danger of arrogance, the importance of understanding your operating environment, and the reality that nature imposes constraints that no amount of military power can overcome. The Wehrmacht was perhaps the most tactically proficient military force of the 20th century, but tactical proficiency without strategic wisdom leads to defeat. The generals who stood in their command tents in October 1941, watching their armies sink into Russian mud, learned this lesson at a cost measured in hundreds of thousands of lives and ultimately in the outcome of the war itself.